Folks, I also want to point out that I have everyone for the class currently registered to take the AP exam sign up. Now, if you come time to pay and you decide you can't pay or don't want to, that's your call. You're on the list. So when we're talking about Martin Van Buren, obviously that's going to absorb all of his time just about as dealing with this economic crisis. But starting back during James Monroe's presidency, with westward expansion, several Americans had migrated to northern Texas. Now, if you're thinking about northern Texas, and the good folks that live there, you might recall that they're already Mexican. And so the Mexicans had not settled much in this part of Texas. And some of these explorer types, these westward settler types, were coming out of Tennessee. So in many cases, they were actually colleagues of Andrew Jackson. And they wanted to migrate to an area that was suitable for settlement. And this place certainly was. It certainly was suitable. I mean, if you think about East and North Texas today, definitely a heavily occupied part of the state. And, people had already settled into to Louisiana. And so what the government there decided to do in Mexico, that is, was to allow an American and his sort of pilgrims, if you want to call them that, a couple hundred families, migrate into his country, his country being Mexico. So the key figure was this guy on the right, Stephen Austin. Initially, him and his family, the Austins, migrated down to what is today where the area near Austin, Texas, in fact. And there were three things that they had to agree with. They had to agree with the Mexican government, which I always consider somewhat ironic when you think about America's sort of nativist attitude towards Hispanic people today. One was, if they were going to come here, there being Texas, they had to learn to speak the language, learn to speak Spanish. Makes sense if you're going to live in a country you speak the language. Two, they had to be Catholic. Now that's a condition that we don't even require today in America, any religious requirement. And, it was likely that they were not going to adhere to that period, but at least the theory was they would pay taxes to support it. And then three, and perhaps most importantly, they weren't going to have slaves here in this new territory. And the irony of all of this arrangement is that the Texans the Texicans, as they were fondly called, didn't do any of that. They didn't learn Spanish. They didn't do away with having slaves, and they sure as heck weren't going to become Mexicanized. But because this was sort of like the distant frontier, and the Mexicans had bigger issues at the time, they pretty much didn't pay much attention to it initially. Pretty much ignored by and large. Because keep in mind, a lot of these folks, these frontier types, were pretty rough and tumble woodsman types anyway. But over time, certainly within the decade, thousands and thousands of more people migrated into this area, and some of them were the adventurous types. Particularly the names I would maybe recall are Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett had already made a name for himself, was a congressman back up in Tennessee, but now he had gone to Texas like so many others. And Jim Bowie of the famous Bowie knife, Jim Bowie. Now, 10 years in, this other figure arrives in Texas, and his name is Sam Houston. So when you think about Texan independence, you got to be aware of the role of the founding by Stephen Austin, I just put him on the left, and Sam Houston here, who would become the sort of governor of Texas, particularly when it was an independent state. And Houston, like Crockett and others, these guys are hard drinking, hard gambling, party types, and they also were slaveholders pretty much. So that meant that from the position of the Mexican government, particularly under its new leadership of Santa Anna de Lopez, that they had to drive these guys out. They needed to go. And then when that happened, Texas declared its independence. Now, keep in mind, 1836, Jackson had kind of made a name for himself as sort of westward expansion. So the expectation was that when the Lone Star State, if you want to call it that, Lone Star Republic, declared its independence, that America would open arms, welcome it to the fray. That did not happen. Initially, America did not extend a welcome and say, hey, come on, join the country. What did happen is some Americans sent weapons. Some Americans even went down and served in the Texas militia. And I would like you to know the leader of the Texas militia, a fellow named William Travis, Travis, William Travis. So you had Houston at the head of the army and Travis as the defending frontier folks that are going to be in this old Spanish mission. So the Alamo is actually not a fort at all. It's a church. And what was happening is Houston's army was further east. And I'll show you where all this is here on a map in just a minute. But the Alamo is today in San Antonio. And if you're walking along the Riverwalk in San Antonio, you can almost miss it, like because these big tall buildings all around it. And then there's this 2-story sort of adobe building there. This is the place there. Ozzy Osbourne, the musician, urinated on this thing and got banned from the state. So nonetheless, if you were in that total state, you could probably slip up on the Alamo and not even realize that's where you were. But back then, it was in the middle of a field or an open plain, really. And when Santa Anna marches northward, crosses the Rio Grande, keeps going northward, this is the only real outpost in southern Texas. And it is very famous for its last stand. The Battle of the Alamo is an absolute massacre of the folks inside this. These are the couple hundred Texans that hold out at the Alamo, and they're trapped and they're wiped out almost to the man. Only one person survives, a slave or a former slave after this. But famously, Crockett gets killed. Bowie died. Bowie seemed to have had tuberculosis, and he'll die in his bed, but there'll be like 4 dead Mexicans around him. And so, again, you should know the name Santa Anna. He's the commanding general here, and he does seize the Alamo. The Alamo is a defeat, but it's a rousing sort of we must win it for the Alamo, folks. So if you're looking on this map, here's the Alamo, real close to the Nueces River here. San Antonio, you can see that. Down here is the Rio Grande. Matamoros is a border town. And so when Santa Anna goes after his victory at the Alamo, he then starts marching eastward towards Galveston, which is where Sam Houston's army, the rest of the army. And Houston keeps hiding, he's like one of these smart retreats, kind of out of the era of George Washington or Robert E. Lee, like a tactical retreat, so to speak. And the Texicans are outnumbered. But in the midday sun, while the Mexican army is resting at a place called San Jacinto, you see it here, San Jacinto. After this defeat, Santa Anna is annihilated, his forces. Now, guys, this will not be the last time we talk about Santa Anna, so don't forget that name. He's going to be involved in just about everything we do with Mexico for the next 30 years. But nonetheless, Houston's victory at San Jacinto spells a major defeat for his army, for Santa Anna's army. He retreats. Actually, he's captured. He's freed on the stipulation that he'll recognize an independent Texas. At the end of the war, this is the problem, everybody. This orange line with the pink. If you think about where Texas is today, the Rio Grande is pretty easy to spot. The Texicans, now Texans, the Lone Star Republic of Texas, that means they're a country for almost 10 years. They will claim the Rio Grande. Here's the Rio Grande. That is not a stipulation in a written treaty, okay? In the first of the treaty, but the second that he claims he was threatened to sign, the Mexicans issue a statement that says this river right here, the Nueces River at Corpus Christi, is the border. So this is an area in dispute, as you can see here, this area. And that's going to be significant when we get close to what's called the Mexican War. So the question then should be, why didn't we accept Texas as a state? Why didn't we annex it? The year is 1836. That should tell you Andrew Jackson's still president. The Panic 1837 has not happened yet. So why not? Well, for really the first time since the Missouri Compromise, 1820, the issue of slavery reemerges. The issue of slavery reemerges. You may recall that under the Compromise of 1820, we had sort of a situation where the two, whenever a state entered the Union, if it was a free state, then the other state that entered the Union needed to be a slave, or vice versa. Well, this would have reopened that dispute, particularly since it was outside of the territory of the Missouri Compromise. So they petitioned for statehood. Actually, they directly for being annexed, but the anti-slavery forces prevented that from becoming a possibility. So if you look, and again, I've never read that the whole goal of this was to spread slavery. The slavery issue kind of came up once the statehood issue was there. But I don't think Davy Crockett moved to Texas to bring a slave state into the Union. Now, I do know later in history, the so-called filibusteros, freebooters, would invade places with the attempt to do that, like Nicaragua. But this does not appear to be one of those. So Texas is going to remain a free, not a free, but a slave nation for almost a decade. And not until we get to the election of James K. Polk will the Texan statehood issue be resolved. So I would definitely be aware of this, particularly since it reignites a little bit, because you can imagine many Southerners are annoyed that here their Southern colleagues, their comrades, who are applying to be Americans. They want Texas to be part of our country, and they're being denied. But in the midst of Van Buren's presidency, that is not going to be something he does popularly. That will not be something that's supported. So that brings us to the election of 1840. Now, the Democrats don't really have much of a choice. They're going to nominate their sitting president. That, of course, is Martin Van Buren. Keep in mind at this point, I should change that. That's just Van Buren taking the blame for his and Jackson's monetary policy. So if you look in here, this is, the thing that Martin Van Buren has run on is sort of like, let's create these independent sub-treasuries that will no longer have money connected to national banking and currency and things like that. But, here he's trying to chase after Jackson, who's vanished off through the Hermitage. And so Van Buren is not going to be a successful coattails politician. He's running on his own incumbency. Now, the Whigs had tried a strategy back in 1836, but it had been ineffective. It was called the favorite son strategy, but Van Buren had still won decisively. So this time they decide, if you can't beat the Dems, let's do what they do, and that is just run a war hero. And William Henry Harrison had a political career. He was the governor of Indiana. He was old by those days, almost 70, but that didn't make him ancient. And of course, today our current president will be the oldest ever. But Harrison, even as governor of Indiana, had not much of a political record. So if you want to really say much about Harrison at all politically, he wasn't Andrew Jackson. That's why the Whigs really landed on him. They said the strategy, and by the way, this would have been the best year, I think, for Henry Clay to have run. Henry Clay's going to run 3 separate times to be president, never win. He'd have probably won this election because Van Buren is so unpopular. But nonetheless, Harrison is a general, a hero, and certainly a war hero. Name is the kind of thing that makes for really good campaign fodder. Now, the person that they choose to run with him is really a mistake, guys. And he's a Virginian. Harrison was born in Virginia. Tyler is a Virginian too. But Tyler represents the sort of states' rights wing of the Whig Party that is anti-Jackson. But the only reason he's in the Whig Party is Jackson's administration. So John Tyler is not really thought, and really this proves to be disastrous. But nonetheless, John Tyler, it's about the only thing you have to remember about him this go round is that the slogan of this campaign, which is Tippecanoe and Tyler too. That's easy to remember, right? Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Now, what they decided to do in this election, and by far this is the most sort of popular campaign election, is they're just going to, they being the Whigs, are just going to out-dim the Dems. They're going to depict William Henry Harrison as born in a log cabin on the frontier, sort of this rough and tumble everyman of the people. So this is a sort of populist slogan, and you're going to see lots of log cabins. Here you see again, log cabin, this frontiersman, the log cabin. He also has the slogan that is most notable is that he is the kind of person who would drink gallons of hard cider, gallons of hard cider. Grew up in a log. So, I think about popular election rhetoric, and a lot of times it's interesting. Now, I hear a lot of people say, Donald Trump, he's a man for us. He says it like it is. He tells us what's on his mind. And that may certainly be true. It certainly resonate true. But, here's a billionaire who's from Manhattan who has virtually nothing to do with ruffian country boys, right? Well, that's how this guy is depicted. You understand? This guy is depicted as Van Buren is depicted as the guy who could never drink hard cider, never survive on the frontier. He's kind of like a softy, a banker. Ugh, how terrible. Meanwhile, William Henry Harrison is a good old boy. He's a frontiersman. This is not accurate. In reality, William Henry Harrison is from the family of Harrisons who signed the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. They're one of the most famous families in America. And he grew up in a mansion, just like Jackson. He had thousands of acres under his control. But this is where you start to see popularized elections based on what we would call hyperbole or rhetoric, and not really not reality, in all honesty. And so they had songs. Here you can see, I'm not going to sing it, but Beat Little Van. Here's the music to go along with it. And so you have a good election, of just sheer politicking. Now, I don't really like that kind of campaign personally, because there is nothing in there really about how to solve the economic crisis. There's nothing in there about slavery. There's nothing in this election about resolving the major issues confronting the American people. So it's really just like so many American elections, an election based on slogans and who do you identify with. I remember back during President Bush's administration, George W., there was a survey done. It's called the beer test. And they're like, which candidate, Mitt Romney or George W. Bush, would you most likely want to have a beer with? Because that meant like ordinary guy you drink a beer with in a bar. And Bush won comfortably. And I always thought that was funny because Bush was a recovering alcoholic. He didn't drink at all. So the likelihood of having a beer with George W. Bush would have been, well, it wouldn't. So nonetheless, we live in funny days, but we have for a long time. So with that election, you can see it was a relatively close one in the popular vote, but as I'm certainly emphasized to you by now, that doesn't matter. It's the electoral vote, all the states with the people in them. Harrison wins by a landslide comfortably. Now, I would point out to you, though, that this is an interesting election for me when you look at where the distribution of votes are. You've got frontiers divided, you've got the South divided. So I don't want you to go out of this chapter and say that the Whigs were the party of solely the South and the West, okay, or the North and the West, or the Dems were only the party of the South. In other words, the two major parties that emerged out of 1828 are not regional parties yet. I mean, they certainly have regional strength. But looking at this map, you could tell that the Dems perform well in parts of the country beyond the South. So I have on your guide beyond the fact that there were major changes in the American political system, keep in mind, the founding fathers would have lurched in their graves at the thought of simply, winning office through mass democracy. But that's the victor. If you're looking at 81, this is the major change that's occurred, where the days of the Federalists sort of being, standing for election are over. Now you're seating, or campaigning. So democracy has become very, very popular. And then the other is a new two-party system. So the second major change is a long-term two-party system. So, keep in mind when you look back at stuff like this, this kind of stuff is sort of ridiculous, but we still run all kinds of popular sloganized campaign elections to this day. So I do want to, I guess, give you a summary here. And I think maybe the best way to do this is to type it in here. I realize I don't actually have it in here. So I'm going to go down here to the end and explain a little bit about who the two parties are again, based on what what you're looking at with the last question in your reading guide here. So if you could go with background. So the background of of the Whigs should be consistent with the Federalists. So if you think about the Feds, the Whigs are the old Federalists, and what before them were called National Republicans. So it's not like they ceased to be, reality. They just emerged in a new era, okay, and a new name. So I'm going to stop this for a second. Excuse me.